You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Friday evening, ladies and gentlemen. Friday, the end of the week. Sometimes the best day of the week for many of us who go out and drive to our jobs every day. And we're like, yeah, damn it, it's Friday. Now, of course, for me, I work for myself. And my studio and my office are all 10 feet away from the rest of the house. So Friday doesn't always represent the coming of the weekend, other than just not getting lots of phone calls and having to feel so busy. But the weekend is full too. So I want to say for all of you who work, have a happy Friday, make it a good one, and enjoy your weekend. Welcome to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And you can go there at odysy1.com to hear the audio version, and come on over to my YouTube channel, where at the same time we are simulcasting the video version of this show. And you can go to youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Join the rest of the Intrepids over there in the chat room and have a good time tonight. So we have been talking about paganism, and yesterday I got off a little long on describing the book The Mists of Avalon, and I only did that because I think it's a wonderful book. I think it's got a lot of information buried in the fictional story, and so I spent some time telling you about that. Many of you have read that book, and some from the outside might look at this as me promoting paganism. Now, I'm not so much promoting it as I am sharing with you my interest over it. Promoting the book, maybe. But paganism seems to be an interesting historical, religious, spiritual study, especially in light of having been in Christianity most of my life and having questions and asking them and looking up historical information and finding that not everything in the biblical scriptures seemed to jive anymore with what I found to be fact. And so to say it was a harrowing crisis-type situation in my life for several years as I was really juggling with this stuff, trying to figure out what was true, what was not true, and trying to appropriate, oh, Jesus, I hate saying this, my personal truth on something. I hate that phrase, because to me, fact is fact. Truth is the culmination of the facts that you gather. Truth might even supersede fact at times. There might be universal truths out there that are different than the facts you seem to accumulate, which then brings you back around that circle to where you may have started. For me, Christianity, I said, what if Christianity is true, exactly how we read it, even though it defies fact? Is there something else along the way that caused the problem? Was there any truth to the charge by early church fathers and historians that said the ancient Messiah types were all diabolical mimicry? Now, if you believe this stuff is by faith, of course, you're going to ask those questions. You're going to say, is a satanic presence really there? Is that presence something that can defile what is right, distract from what is right and good? But then that leads to the rest of the questions of, why isn't God more powerful? Why isn't he powerful enough to subdue that when Satan or the devil or the evil presence is supposed to be something he created and has control over? If he is the sovereign, and I say he, she, whatever you want to call it, let's stick in that Christian context. If he is all-powerful and the ruler of the universe and the sovereign over everything and the creator of all, does he not have the ability to control his creation? And he certainly can with humans, it seems, from a Christian context. Why can he not do that with the Satan or the deceiver or the evil one and so on? And so if there was diabolical mimicry, why couldn't God simply undo that, reshuffle the deck, show us something different? Why are we to rely on our finite mental capacities to comprehend and appropriate something infinite and not understandable? So I hail back to Indiana Jones, who said, fact is what you're seeking in archaeology, he said, in the context of a fictional motion picture. He said, archaeology is the seeking for fact, not truth. He said, if you want truth, go down to Professor so-and-so's philosophy class down the hall. And so we're looking for fact, and my way of doing this, of deciphering things, is a lifelong study. Because you know what I think? I think you're never going to hit on all the facts. What I think is you have to examine things as much as you can with a cognitive, conscious adult mind. Figure out where you are, what you want to believe. Even the Apostle Paul, who, you know, most of us, we know that there are questions about the kind of person he was and whether or not he hijacked Christianity. Let's take that and set that aside for a second. Even he wrote about the fact that you needed to work out your own salvation/religion with meekness and fear. So the principle there being with a calm spirit, with a respect for what is there. You've got to work this all out yourself. You've got to figure things out yourself. And God certainly doesn't seem to be going out of his way in a Christian, Judeo-Christian context, or even Islamic context, to prove himself to anybody. And so there must be something there that either we're missing or that is missing in the context of those ancient stories. So, like Jesus Christ Superstar said, if you'd have come today, you would have reached a whole nation. Israel in 4 BC had no mass communication. So, there's that to throw into the mix as well. So I'm opening up all other cans of worms and avenues of discussion, but let's stick for a moment to paganism. I want to look at this. In paganism, we see it manifested today in Wiccanism, I guess you'd call it, in witchcraft and things like that. And we've discussed many times about the veracity of witchcraft. Not all pagans are Wiccans, but I think a lot of your Wiccans are pagan. They hail back to ancient ways. And something I wanted to look at before we kind of get into some meat here is you're seeing a rise in neo-paganism in American culture. You're seeing the fight for Wiccans and pagans to be represented with religious symbols on an official basis. I know one of the things in the last decade that I saw fought for was soldiers who died and were buried at Arlington Cemetery or buried in some of the official military cemeteries around the country. You could find the Star of David for Judaism put on some of the grave markers. You could find the cross of Jesus put on many of the grave markers, but the Wiccans did not have a symbol for their religion, and it was really shunned until more recently. And you've started seeing, I remember it made the news with the first grave marker that had a Wiccan symbol on it. And so you're starting to see an acceptance level come about. And paganism, this whole thing of going back to, it's interesting. I've been watching a series, and I do this late at night. When I don't sleep, I wake up and I watch stuff on YouTube on the big TV in the living room and fall back to sleep but a series called Time Team. And if you remember him, it is Sir Tony Robinson, who is the host of that show. And they've been doing this show for about 20 years in Great Britain, and it's a show about archaeology in Great Britain. And Tony Robinson, if you remember him, if you remember the old Blackadder series with Rowan Atkinson that was out in the 70s and the 80s, Blackadder's sidekick, his servant, Baldric, was played by Tony Robinson. I always want to say Robertson. And so he actually, in real life, is a writer, a child actor, a children's actor, children's writer, and a producer, a director. And he went on to Time Team about 20 years ago. And I watched them uncovering all these sites around Britain, mostly old medieval sites to Stone Age sites to Roman sites. And it goes back into that pagan era. A lot of places that they uncover. And this refreshes in my mind that different way of life that was invaded upon, stepped into by the Romans, who also, after the first century, started introducing Christianity into the British Isles. And the pagan religions seemed to diminish after that time, just as Gnosticism did. And Gnostic mysticism, as we've talked about weeks ago, started to subside. But now in America, you're seeing a lot of this regain some footing. I think people have grown incredibly weary of organized religion. There might be true believers in there. Let's call them, for lack of a better descriptor for this particular point in this conversation, the born-again evangelicals. I think there are a lot of people I knew, especially in the 70s and the 80s, that were in that born-again movement, the Jesus Freak movement. Do you remember that, the Jesus Freaks? Not a derogatory term. They used a derogatory term and called themselves Jesus Freaks. That whole born-again, evangelical music, all of this stuff movement. And I see a lot of those people that I rubbed shoulders with back then dropping away from that. It almost had the feel of, you remember the old ecstatic movements where throughout history were ecstaticism. You could glory, you raise your hands, and it's the stuff like you see in the Pentecostal church. And that tends to be something that burns out quickly because it's surface emotion. It's not something that many people have appropriated and it's stuck with them for decades. You have to move on because when you start seeing the rules and the regulations that are put on by the church and things like that, you start seeing the contradictions in Scripture. You start experiencing these things and you start to question. And when you start to question, you start to doubt. And when you start to doubt, you start opening yourself up to other things. And so we're seeing it now in America. Is this a falling away from God, the one true holy God? Or is this a falling away from a Christian version of God? And saying, that's just not cutting it anymore. There's more to this. It has all the earmarks of being like any other religion that wants to, I hate using this, that wants to control its followers. And so that's the same thing I experienced, is that I had this falling away from that faith. And so you're seeing this widespread in Western culture now, that Christianity, I think, is no longer that top-ranking religion in our culture. We're not a Christian nation anymore. We are a Christianized nation in the United States, I'm talking, for all my British and my New Zealander friends and my Australian friends and European friends that are listening. So this is my base point when I start looking into this stuff. And this is why I encourage you to look into this stuff, to find out what it is you can find to believe that is true for you. Then there's that whole spiritual element that is very different when you start getting into personal spirituality, when you start going beyond what we called about in the ancient mysticism, the Gnostic mysticism, the extrovert, external stuff that draws you in. Then you sink in and you ask questions. You ask the deeper questions, and you have to figure out what it is you believe. And I don't see God in a evangelical sense being there to kind of nudge me, go, yeah, see, yeah, you're getting it. You're coming my way. And maybe that's just me. Maybe some of you experience that who are in Judeo-Christianity. I have stepped outside that box. But of course, you're always plagued then by questions of, now, cut the crap, everybody. We all have our outward show that we put out there. Well, I don't believe that, and I believe I am a god, and I am a this and that. But when it comes down to it, when we come to death's door, if we have that opportunity to know death is coming, and it's not sudden, but when we realize our mortality, does that old stuff come back up and you go, what if I'm wrong? What if that stuff is right? Now, maybe from the perspective of not feeling like I'm going to die tomorrow, we don't think about those things. Or we go, I'm still where I am. We never know until we're down to that moment, do we? And I haven't been there to that moment of decisiveness where I say, I think I'm going to die. Or I know death is coming. I sometimes wonder how I will be, and hopefully it's a long time in the future, but that time where I know death is coming. I already know it's coming. I already see him way out on the hillside out there. I don't know what he looks like yet, but he's way out there. Because I'm closer to that now than I was 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever that day is. But in our heart of hearts, what is it that we choose to believe? There's the big question. What do we choose to practice versus what do we choose to believe? And what's going to be that thing that we believe when we come down to those final days? There's some questions to ask yourself and look internally. Now, it seems kind of trite now, but I've got to move on in my presentation here. It seems a little trite to do this at the moment, but I was going to cover the way movies and television shows have started to introduce a softer, gentler approach to the old paganism. And I've got a list of some things and some notes on some things here. And then we're going to jump into the whole paganism and Christianity thing, the blending of it in a little more heavy-duty, if you will, scholarly, academic, get out your syllabus type of examination in this. And we may or may not hit it today even yet, but we're working toward it. But for a Friday, I thought it was kind of nice to go through a couple of things and take a look at things. And I love the movies. And I have many friends who are pagans. I've been exposed to paganism, witchcraft, and Wiccanism. I once dated, before my lovely wife Rainey came into my life, I dated a woman for 4 years who was a sole practitioner of Wicca. Which just means she didn't want to be involved with anybody else. She was doing her own thing. And it's hard to escape the war on paganism that Hollywood's always been waging. If you're a horror movie fan, you're going to see paganism. They were always if it wasn't a priest who had gone astray and was murdering people or molesting children, which Hollywood depicted, was always the priest was the bad guy, in very rare exceptions. With very rare exceptions, it was the dark occult and the witchcraft and the witches and the pagans that were the ones that were doing the black magic behind the scenes and causing problems. And it's not just in the horror genre. Disney was the original front runner of this war. Since their first motion picture, Snow White, animated motion picture, and the Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. If you ever saw that, watch the original one. MGM's The Wizard of Oz, that first portrayed a witch in a positive light with Glinda, the Witch of the North. But they also had the Wicked Witch of the West and the Wicked Witch of the East, whom Dorothy's house fell on. Unfortunately, there's no such character was to be seen on the screens for at least a decade after that, showing witches in a positive light. But in recent years now, witches, paganism in general, have started to come out as a positive figure. Instead of being these portrayed as these wicked evil doers that are in league with darkness and dark magics. And in the midst of Christian attack on Hollywood, because of recent realistic and historic portrayals of Christians in movies like The Mist and The Red Riding Hood and so on, and how they're claiming persecution when their more evil nature is given a light for once. And I feel a list compiled of movies that portray pagans and witches and witchcraft and so on is more honest, truthful, and positive counterbalance to the way they've been portrayed before. And I'll be adding and talking about some things that you might not even have considered as being promoting of witchcraft or paganism. And so I want you to take a close look at this. And by the way, I've also seen some newer fare out there that say Sabrina. There's a new, I think it's a Netflix series, and my wife started watching it, and it's pretty dark. But it's got its black comedy moments as well. Blonde witch, Sabrina the young woman going to the witch's school and stuff like this. Not very Harry Potter, by the way. And all existing in current day small town. And I have found that when you saw the leadership in these pagan witchcraft circles, they were very demonic and very dark. But it also showed the brighter side of these things. But then it also included things that were problematic for our culture, I think, for the way we our mores and our values. And the having sex in the woods with somebody you don't know for ritual purposes. Now, maybe some of us are like, hey, yeah, right on, bring it. But there were things that seemed to be connected to all of that looked very dark to me. And while it's an enjoyable series to watch, I wouldn't want my kids watching that to learn how to live life. I want to instill those things in my kids that are good things. So that aside, that's a off the top of the head critique of that. You might want to watch that just to get an idea what that is. But let's go through a little list here. Look at Disney's animated cartoon. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful animated motion picture, Moana, taking place in the South Sea Islands. And she's the daughter of a chief who goes on a mission to find the demigod Maui and to force him to return a stolen jewel, the heart of the goddess, to Fiti. And this movie is steeped in Polynesian lore and legend, and with a beautiful encounter with the great goddess at the end. This is paganism, pure and raw. But we don't realize that when we're watching it. I don't think it's dangerous. I think it's wonderful. I think it's beautiful. Watch Moana if you want to see something that has this beautiful presentation of the goddess. And it's toward the end of the movie. Beowulf was a movie that came out. When did that come out? About 10 years ago? 12 years ago? It's stunning. It's CGI. It's an animated movie that follows the Viking saga. And you know what? I'm at the end of this first segment. I just saw my clock tick up. And so let's pick this up in about 2 minutes when I come back, and we'll examine more of this. So stay tuned and sit tight. Hey folks, thanks for staying on through the break. Welcome back. And I cut us off abruptly at the end of the first segment. I ran out of time there and I didn't realize I wasn't watching the clock. So we're talking about paganism in the movies and a presentation of paganism and a presentation of Wiccanism. We started with Moana, just touched on Beowulf. And let's just pick that up right away with no fanfare. And by the way, folks, you're listening to the Intrepid radio program with me, your host, Scotty Roberts, here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And that's ODYSY1.com. Or you're watching the simulcast on my video live stream at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Come on over and join our live chat room with the rest of the Intrepheads for this Intrepid radio program and find a fun and lively discussion going on. Great place to be on a Friday night. So let's go back to Beowulf. That's the second one. It's stunning. It's a CGI movie. Follows the Viking saga of Beowulf. His successful saving of a village from the ogre Grendel. And then he becomes king after a torrid affair with the ogre's mother, only to have his life and his people fall victim to the offspring of his unnatural union. So there's some paganism, old paganism, and that Norse paganism. I look at shows like my kids watch this. Do you ever think of this? Dinosaur Train. It's a very educational show. It's animated, 3D animation, as can be expected from PBS. The show consists of a dinosaur family that takes learning field trips on the time-traveling dinosaur train. And it's a ridiculous aspect of the show, but it's easily forgiven. But the dinosaurs celebrate the winter and the summer solstices, which is very refreshing for pagans. It provides children with entertainment, but it supports the normalization of pagan holidays. So the winter and summer solstice, we talk about those things sometimes and don't even realize. I hear on the weather reports it's the solstice or it's the equinox, but we don't realize their sources in pagan holidays, which we talked about just last week. There's some of these I'm just going to skip. There's one that I saw that I thought was pretty well done. It's a movie we watched with our kids called The Last Keepers. And it has some familiar actors in there. You're going to recognize some faces. I think, is it Virginia Madsen? I think is the woman who plays the mother in this. But it was a really good movie. It's a movie that, let's put it this way, for too long, Christianity held a monopoly on movies about family, faith, morals, and God. And in this movie, this movie comes along and it turns that whole thing on its head. And it shows that Wiccan families can be highly moral people of strong faith, strong family values, and devout spirituality. The movie launches with a burning times scene which totally misleads you into expecting yet another witchcraft movie along the lines of Teen Witch and stupidity like that. But in the end of the next scene, I was truly amazed. After we're introduced to the family members, which include an amazing father figure played by Aidan Quinn. You remember him. He was in such movies as, remember the one with Sandra Bullock and, what's her name, for Pete's sake, was married to Tom Hanks. Strawberry Blonde. Why am I not thinking of her name? You know who she is. Glamorous, beautiful actress. They played sisters in that movie. Practical Magic. That's the movie I'm thinking of. And so Aidan Quinn plays the father, and we're treated to a family praying to the goddess at the dinner table. And not some Hollywood version either. It's a legit praying and prayer, just as any pagan family would do in the real world. And later in the movie, the family celebrates Mabon together by dressing, walking out into nature, collecting items for offerings, walking the spiral around their family altar. And as a family, they give their offspring to the goddess and the sun god in what is one of the most beautiful rituals that I've ever seen portrayed on screen of paganism. And it's all in a loving family setting, normalizing the fact that pagans are loving, religious, spiritual people as well. And the story in the movie is great. And it revolves around the teen daughter. She's coming of age. She's learning to deal with being different from the other kids in school, as well as being on the verge of discovering that she has magical powers that go beyond standard magic. And this is where the fanciful part of the movie comes in. And so I would recommend watching this. It is a movie that can be ruined by overuse of profanity by the bullies and her friends who are walking racial stereotypes. She's a Satan, this young girl. She's a nerd. She's super smart. She loves talking street. What up, bro? Things like that. What up, ho? Later, just language doesn't bother me so much. But when it's used not to really further the story, but to try to paint an unrealistic picture of people, I have a problem with that. So, this movie, I think, is beautifully filmed. It's got vibrant colors, an amazing soundtrack. It features music from real pagan artists. It's a wholesome family movie with an amazing message. And you should go watch that. Again, it's called, this is a movie called The Last Keepers. That's a good Hollywood entering. Now, you've got Braveheart. Let's go back a few years. That movie is now, 25 years old? 24 years old? Before Mel Gibson was really coming out and doing movies like The Passion. He wanted to do one on Judas Maccabeus, which never got off the ground. I hear he's working on or considering a sequel to The Passion of Christ, where he follows the followers of Jesus after this. So, of course, Braveheart, it's a dramatic adaptation of the real-life William Wallace, a Scottish warrior who fought against the Christian tyranny of the English. And while his own tribe was forced into Christianity by the tyrannical government controlling the people, they still held reverence for the ancient Celts and the ways of the Druids. A great example of this was a funeral scene after his uncle Argyle comes on the scene. And his father is dead, and they're giving him a funeral. And he says something about forbidden songs played on forbidden pipes. And the melodies played on the instruments, they were played on, they were 100% pagan. Rosin Dube, I think, was the tune that was being played during that funeral. The forbidden tune on a forbidden pipes, which Rosin Dube is Black Rose. And the severe pagan elements in this film were well suppressed, but the present, they were present there nonetheless. So Braveheart even. You got things like The Fairies, low budget, Charlotte's Web, Charlotte's Web, movie for kids. And the family classic is embedded with pagan values right to the core. It deals with friendship, love, kindness to animals. All through the film, we're shown the turning of the seasons of the year, the yearly wheel, the annual wheel. It presents the little girl from Fern coming of age and passing into womanhood. The spider Charlotte presents life, death, and rebirth by sacrificing herself to carry on through her children. For in death, she's reborn. It's that resurrection thing. And all of this is set on a farm where humans live in complete synchronicity with nature. So you never think about that. There is a pagan theme beneath that. The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey. The Lord of the Rings trilogy, the original movies that were made, as well as the Hobbit trilogy, have a strong pagan undercurrent in them, maybe more than even J.R.R. Tolkien had in his books. You're brought strong alongside a band of heroes that are wrought with pagan values of friendship, loyalty, truth, honor, and perseverance in the face of adversity on their quest through the world of magic. Now, some may say those are also Judeo-Christian values. Yes, they are. But there's an underlying paganism behind it. John Carter of Mars. So now I loved this movie, by the way. I read this book to my kids, Edgar Rice Burroughs. And while it's a science fiction movie, it's really a pretty good movie. And the cultures on Mars were worshippers of the goddess, who is represented by the Earth. Earth is the goddess in their sky. And to hear that from a Disney movie is pretty out of the norm. One of the better movies I have seen in years, and I have made mention of this movie before, is the movie Agora. And it's the story of Hypatia of Alexandria. It shows the exile and the persecution of pagans from the late Roman Empire, as well as the Jews, by the way, and at the hands of the newly born cult of Christianity. You get to witness the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, which was an historical event, and the desecration of the Agora. Agora was it's a Greek word for the marketplace, the open forum where people would gather, like a mall. It's kind of like a mall, but with a little different connotation to it. And so you witness these things. You see the desecration of the Agora at the hands of early Christians who operated in a pack mentality, a mob mentality. It's an in-depth story that, contrary to what the movie's description says, follows not a slave turned Christian, but the beautiful Hypatia. Rachel Weisz, you saw her in the Mummy movies. She plays a pagan philosopher who is on the discovery that the world is indeed not flat, nor is it the center of the universe. Even as the entire world seems to be collapsing about her, she still can't let go of her obsession to unveil the truth of the cosmos. She's also unwittingly torn between two men in the movie, the new emperor who adores her, and, the governor. He's not an emperor. I've got emperor written here. And one of her former slaves who has become a Christian, who himself is torn between his desire for her and his newfound religion. And that dictates that he must murder her in the story for her being what was known to the Christians as, or labeled as, being a witch, because she was a pagan philosopher. And she was a scientist. And their science seemed to contradict what they believed in the pages of the Bible, as early as this was in history, in the 300s. And even though the marketeers of the film try to distance the character of Hypatia from any faith disposition, after watching the film, it's clear to see she still remains loyal to her pagan teachings, even in the face of certain death. And Hypatia of Alexandria was murdered at the orders of Cyril, the bishop of Alexandria. And she was dragged from her chariot in the streets, flayed alive, and burned to death. As if flaying wouldn't kill you. I think your body would be in such shock. But it was because she was a woman teaching pagan science and religion in a world that Cyril wanted to see. I think I might have said Cyrus. Cyril of Alexandria wanted to see become fully Christian. And later, of course, the church canonized Cyril of Alexandria to become Saint Cyril of Alexandria. But I'm going to tell you, awesome, incredibly fantastic movie. You should watch that. And there's many other things here. The Lightning Thief. This is Percy Jackson and the Olympians. Rick Riordan Fair. The Mists of Avalon is a good movie. It was a better mini-series before they had to chop it up to make it into a movie, and an even better book, which we talked about yesterday. Witchfinder General. Some of these are B movies. Clash of the Titans, the old Clash of the Titans. The Good Witch is one. Black Death. The Gift. You can look at Bewitched. This was with, again, you're seeing Will Ferrell, and I got to see her name. Nicole Kidman. That's the one I was thinking of from Practical Magic with Sandra Bullock. And she actually does a great portrayal in this movie of Elizabeth Montgomery, playing Samantha Stevens, the witch, in the old 1960s television series. The Wizard of Oz, of course, Bigfoot and the Witches. You'll have to see that one. That's interesting. I haven't seen all of these myself. I look at things like The Wicker Man, the old version, the 60s version. Not the Nick Cage version of this, the update, wasn't as good. It didn't dig as deep. But you see paganism in that. Poltergeist, Poltergeist 2, Lord of the Rings, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Scooby-Doo. How about that? Scooby-Doo and paganism. Avatar. I'm just going to go through this list. Lovecraft. Teen Witch. And, of course, Practical Magic. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful movie. That's the one with Bullock and Nicole Kidman. You got to watch that one. That if you haven't seen it, it's a very good movie. Harry Potter movies are filled with paganism, with magic. The Craft, of course. Stupid TV series, I thought. But these are just some of the things that are out there. That's the fare that is available out there. So you can find paganism being given a little bit of, a little more positive, what's the word I'm looking for? A little more positivity. Let's leave it there in the movies. And you're seeing more of this coming out. And especially The Last Keepers and Practical Magic, which is now becoming an older movie. It's at least 15 years old. But that first one that I talked to you about, that movie, I highly recommend watching it. The Last Keepers. Go look that one up, where it shows paganism in a loving family setting. Now, we could go on with that kind of stuff forever. Books and movies and so on. And from time to time, I'll present those things to you. Now, you have to ask, why am I spending this much time on this? Why am I looking at even pop culture when I am not a Wiccan and I am not a pagan? It's because, as I've said, I'm interested in these things. I've researched these things. I've talked about these things. I've got somebody I know that I don't want to give away any information that I'm not supposed to. But this person works in forensic psychology and is dealing with somebody who is connected, it seems, to really ancient magics. And coming up with some very different information. And she's studying this stuff as well and trying to understand it. And so, here's the big question. If you step way back from all of this, you'll notice in Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, if you read the Bible, if you heard the stories and went to church and so on, all of this stuff always had things where God was telling his people, Israel, to fight against the Baal worship and the pagan. He didn't call it paganism in the scripture, but to fight against these things, constantly burn down the groves, take down the standing stones, destroy their temples, destroy the worshipers, the infidels. And to me, this is exactly what Islam does when we look at Islam and say the radical, evil, terroristic side of Islam, those practitioners and what they do, is not much different than what we saw in the Old Testament. Oh, except Christianity and Judaism will justify it by saying, but this was God telling us, and they worship a false God. You got to get that all aside. Take a big step out and look. All through history, human history, has been paganism, the belief system of the common folk, the connections to ancient magics, to ancient spirituality, punctuated by formalized religions along the way. Christianity, Judaism, Islam, the big Abrahamic religions. And of course, you've got all the other religions we aren't even referring to in this talk, where Shintoism, Hinduism, Buddhism, all of these different Eastern religions. And so you've got different religions that are in there that are, some of them built on the ancient, more pagan ways, and some that try to pull and stand out as a contrast to them. But this has been all through history up to this present day. So in a more formal look at this, we just say that paganism is commonly used to refer to these various largely unconnected religions that existed during antiquity. Ancient times we're talking about. Also the Middle Ages, the Greco-Roman religions of the Roman Empire, the Roman imperial cult, the various mystery religions, the Gnosticism, the Neoplatonism, the monotheistic religions. These are all things that were more localized ethnic religions practiced both inside and outside the Roman Empire. During the Middle Ages, the term was also adapted to refer to religions practiced outside the former Roman Empire, such as Germanic paganism, Slavic paganism, Baltic paganism, and so on. And from the point of view of the early Christians, these religions are qualified as ethnic or Gentile, ethnikos, gentilis. Let me do that one again. Ethnikos gentilis. I mentioned this yesterday, which translates into Goyim in Judaism, those who are not Jewish. And Christianity eliminated all of those faiths referred to as pagan through a mixture of peaceful conversion, persecution, military conquest of pagan peoples, the Christianization of Lithuania in the 1400s, which is one of the later versions of this wiping out of paganism, is typically considered to mark the end of this process. And the term pagan was typically not used to refer to non-Christian peoples with whom Christians interacted after that point, such as during colonization and so on. And so the early Christians, and now let me qualify something here. We've only got about 3 minutes left here, 2 minutes. I'm not speaking against Christianity. I'm trying to relay historical events, how these things historically took place. The spirituality we can get into later and in other ways. But Christianity did set about, as did Judaism in its origins, and mostly through its history, set out to wipe out the believers of other religions. And early Christianity rose as a movement with the Second Temple Jerusalem, or Herod's Temple, following the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. They had a missionary commitment to both Jews and to the Gentiles, the non-Jews. Christianity spread very rapidly in the first century into the greater Roman Empire and beyond. And here Christianity came into contact with dominant pagan religions. In the book of Acts in the New Testament, Acts 19. Let me check my time here. Looking at my clock tick away. Acts 19 recounts a riot that occurred in Ephesus, instigated by silversmiths who crafted images of Artemis and the goddesses, and they were concerned that Paul's success was cutting into their trade. And by the 2nd century, many Christians were converts from paganism. And these conflicts are recorded in the works of early Christian writers, such as Justin Martyr. As well, he's the one that came up with the diabolical mimicry notion, as well as hostile reports from writers including Tacitus and Suetonius. And there were persecutions also of early Christians. Christianity was persecuted by Roman imperial authorities early on in its history within the greater empire. And by the early part, and you think they'd have an affinity with the pagans because of this, but by the early part of the 2nd century, Christians are no longer viewed as part of a Jewish sect, but are considered as belonging to one of the many foreign cults that infiltrated the Roman Empire. They gradually became conspicuous by their absence from festival activities, where ritual sacrifices for health and the empire and the well-being of the empire took place, and it was a behavior that carried a whiff of both sacrilege and treason. And we got to stop it there. I want us to look more at the history of paganism in contrast to Christianity. We'll hit this again on Monday. I hope you find this stuff interesting. Send me any comments you have. Good to see you here tonight. We're going to take a break for the weekend. Have a fun one. See you back here Monday night.